Good evening again, everyone. I'm Rahsaan Hall. Thank you for joining us at Representation Matters. We're just going to wait 1 or 2 more minutes for a few more folks to join, but while you wait, you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. You can share your name, your pronouns, and where in the state you're based or what organization you're representing. So about 1 more minute, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Rahsaan Hall. I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts, and welcome to Representation Matters, a community briefing on redistricting. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Drawing Democracy Coalition and the Drawing Democracy Fund. Our keynote speaker this evening is Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, who is currently in the House of Representatives taking a vote. So she may be a little delayed getting here, but we will go ahead with the program and put things a little out of order for the agenda and welcome her when she arrives. When you all were invited, I'm sure you were kind of in the midst of reeling from this past election. And even though the election and its results are technically over, the wheels of democracy keep on turning. Starting in 2021, the Massachusetts legislature is tasked with drawing voting district lines, and the stakes are high. This redistricting process can either distort representation or make our democracy more equitable and reflective of all communities. And so a group of organizations that have come together as the Drawing Democracy Fund, as philanthropic organizations have come under the umbrella of the Drawing Democracy Fund, as well as grassroots and advocacy organizations that have come together under the Drawing Democracy Coalition, have engaged in this work of making sure that the representation that is going to happen in this Commonwealth is fair and equitable. I'd like to acknowledge some of the coordinators and organizers of this event, namely the Philanthropy Massachusetts, the Census Equity Fund, Common Cause Massachusetts, the ACLU of Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Voter Table. To be clear, redistricting in Massachusetts has been fraught. But the 2011 process marked a distinct new direction that helped increase majority-minority state legislative districts and draw a majority-minority congressional district that was ripe for Boston City Councilor at large Ayanna Pressley to challenge an incumbent and become Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, the first Black woman to represent the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in Congress. As I'm sure many of you are aware, redistricting is the process by which census data is used to redraw lines and boundaries of electoral districts within the state. This process impacts all levels of government, from local school boards and city councils to state legislatures and the United States House of Representatives. The way districts are drawn, particularly in Black and Latinx communities, can determine if our communities will be able to elect representatives of their choice to serve on local school boards, city councils, the state legislature, and Congress. It can also influence whether or not those elected officials respond to the community's needs, such as ensuring equal educational opportunities, improving healthcare access, responding to a deadly global pandemic, or enacting police reform. Drawing Democracy is committed to a fair redistricting process which is critical to a healthy and reflective democracy. We strive to achieve fair districts that equitably represent communities of color, low-income people, and immigrants through a transparent process and maximum community engagement. Historic practices of unfair redistricting had in the past diminished the political power of communities of color in Massachusetts. I'm sure there are several of you who are familiar with the Black Political Task Force lawsuit in 2002 that challenged the legislative districts drawn that, if allowed to exist, would have disenfranchised Black voters in the city of Boston. Specifically, the court found, among other things, that Speaker of the House Thomas Finneran, his office, refused to meet with quote unquote minority community leaders, and that the redistricting committee simultaneously packed minority voters into a tiny number of districts and splintered the minority vote in other more variegated districts in an effort to protect white incumbents. Those who are students of history will also recall that the subsequent federal investigation and then Speaker Finneran's dishonesty led to a federal indictment and a brief stint in prison. Not wanting to be drawn into that same controversy, the legislature was a lot more receptive to a community-driven process. And in 2011, community leaders, philanthropy, legal advocates all worked together as the Drawing Democracy Project and united with state lawmakers behind a collaborative, transparent, and data-driven process to create district maps that accurately reflected communities of color and low-income people. As a result, the legislature increased the number of majority-minority House districts from 10 to 20, increased the number of majority-minority Senate seats from 2 to 3, and created the first majority-minority congressional district, Massachusetts 7th Congressional District, that was handily won by tonight's keynote speaker. The reality of this district, as well as several of the majority-minority districts, other majority-minority districts, was a function of the open and transparent process that the legislature engaged in. The Drawing Democracy Project was a key leader in the effort to educate and mobilize community organizations and residents throughout the Commonwealth. We regularly met with the Legislative Redistricting Committee, shared proposals for the creation of several majority-minority districts. The map that was ultimately adopted by the legislature was largely modeled on one of two proposed plans that the Drawing Democracy Coalition presented to the committee. By extending the district to include Randolph, Massachusetts 7th, captured a significant number of Black residents, and more specifically, it increased the minority citizen voting age population of the district, making it the first majority-minority congressional district in Massachusetts. And that is a significant shift, and it was due in part to the advocacy of a lot of folks on the ground. And so tonight we will hear from a panel that includes some of the people and organizations that were there the last time, but also those who have continued to do the work and are prepared for this time. The panel includes a funder, a legal advocate, a grassroots organizer, who will help us gain an appreciation for what is truly at stake in 2021. And in order for this experiment of democracy to work, it must truly be representative. Again, as I stated at the outset, we've heard from Congresswoman Pressley's office that the House is taking a vote. She was slated to speak right now, so we're going to switch the order and we'll have our panel. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into full bios of the panelists, only because when Congresswoman Pressley arrives, she only has a limited amount of time and she'll have to go back to take another vote. And so we'll pause with the Q&A that I'm sure many of you will have for our panelists and return to that once Congresswoman Pressley leaves us. So for the panel this evening, we are fortunate to have David Moy, who is the interim executive director of the Hyams Foundation, Yvonne Espinoza-Madrigal, who is the executive director of Lawyers for Civil Rights, and Isabel Gonzalez-Webster, who is the director of the Worcester Interfaith organization. So I'd like to begin by asking a question to you, David, to talk about what happened in 2001 and kind of leading up to coming together as funders, as the philanthropic community to start the Drawing Democracy project, and then maybe reflect on what happened through that project from a philanthropy standpoint, but also what are you seeing moving forward?
Yeah. Thank you, Rahsaan, and thanks for all folks who've joined today. I see that some of the original members, funders, as well as community groups are present. So that's really heartwarming, because we need you and we need to expand the circle. But stepping back, as Rahsaan said, hey, you know, we've seen the last 4 years that elections have consequences. We've been hearing that on, and those consequences are playing out right now. So if elections have consequences, true representation really matters, because it is who will be responded to in terms of priorities, in terms of funding, in terms of representation. And we are seeing that played out even now, right, with transportation, COVID relief, and all those different matters. But stepping back to what happened in 2000 and why I should talk about it as a person, as a community activist in 2000 at the State House, dealing with Tom Finneran, who was the Speaker of the House at that point. Here was a person who was at that point called King Tom, because he was even more powerful than the governor because of his control over the State House. I remember going up there as a community activist with my partners in Roxbury and Dorchester to talk about early education, adult training, transportation, and we would sit with King Tom and be in his district and say, every time we left, we felt like we didn't get anything. And why is that? And I think why that was the fact that in that period of time, we didn't have true representation. Tom Finneran lived in Mattapan, one of the communities with the most number of people of color, and yet he doesn't deem it appropriate to respond to the needs of his constituents or the issues that we raised with him. And at that point, I didn't understand this process, but what became clear to us is that he was part of a gerrymandering process that allowed him to secure, fracking the people of color votes, and then bringing in folks who were more like him and more in synergy with his interests to re-elect him. But the bottom line of that was in 2000, again, we went through this process where, as Rahsaan recounted, they were gerrymandering again, and he was caught lying about it and paid a price for that. But anyways, that is a segue as a community activist going into this world in 2010, knowing what that means and the impact that redistricting have. We were able, or I should say, I was part of the foundation that really wanted to highlight the issues, the importance of redistricting. And I think at that point in time, philanthropy was more focused on services in general, and not realizing that, again, elections have consequences. It has policy implications. It has funding implications. It has all of those different pieces that makes it virtually impossible for us to have a true democracy were we not to fight and ensure that there's a true representative redistricting process that allows the communities of interest that exist in this state to be represented. And I think Ayanna is certainly an indication of that. But I think, Rachel Rollins or any number of this current city council members that have emerged to represent their communities in a truthful way has actually elevated the issues that we all care about, either as civic engagement funders or as funders who care about good services to the communities that we care about. So that is why we're involved, and we hope to remain involved and engage with you all. And the exciting thing about this process is from early on, community partners are at the table helping us shape this and really, really building out a robust redistricting process that I think will be looked at from across the country as a model. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, David. I think that's really helpful. And to bring in that experience of what it is like to be an advocate on the ground, dealing with people in positions of power and helping to build out a process that allows that allows the people to speak truth to power and push back against that. Yvonne, I want to turn to you now, because Lawyers for Civil Rights, then the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, was a part of the Drawing Democracy project and provided technical support in helping explain how redistricting worked, what the legal implications of it were, getting access to the mapping software that the advocates used, which I think is a huge part of that victory. But you know, the celebration of that map and that process largely kind of centered on the Congressional District, but there are a lot of other districts that exist that grew out of that, but some that didn't get touched. And so talk a little bit about the work of Lawyers for Civil Rights when it comes to local districts and the work that you all have done to make sure that those districts are representative of the people who live there.
Thank you, Rahsaan, and it's such a pleasure to be here with you and so many friends and colleagues, David, Isabel, who we're working with in Worcester through Worcester Interfaith, Savannah, who is in the audience from the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association, our community partner in Lowell, Pam from Common Cause, and the list goes on. It's just wonderful to be among so many allies. So yes, absolutely. We've at Lawyers for Civil Rights provided free legal support and technical assistance back in the other redistricting cycles, and we are gearing up to do the same thing for this redistricting cycle in partnership with many of the people sitting at this table. So this is really a coalition effort led by Drawing Democracy, of which we are proud to be a part. And so we will continue to do that piece in terms of the technical, legal, and technology piece. And I want to flag two things before I answer the question that you asked me about the districts. This redistricting cycle is going to be different for a number of factors. One is the technology is a lot more available. You know, in other redistricting cycles in 2000 and 2010, 2011, the technology just was not available in the same way that we have it now. Open source software is available. In Lowell, for example, where we sued to create a majority minority district, we have a platform that has allowed community members to just go online and create their own districts, create their own map. And so this is the type of model that I think is going to be critical for the redistricting cycle, is how do we democratize access to the technology so that this isn't a top-bottom process, but rather a bottom-up process where people on the ground are actually leading this effort, grassroots groups, community advocates who know their communities are the ones driving the bus. And that is really important. It's always been a part of what Drawing Democracy has done. But now with the more accessible technology, I think we could take it one step further. And the other point that I think is really salient for this conversation is that it's not just technology that has changed. The communities where we lived have changed demographically from 2000 to 2010 to now, as the census data is going to show. And so many people in this meeting were leading efforts to get the count up for the census. And so that data is going to be critical. And so what it's going to show, for example, just to put it in a very blunt way, that the historical black-white binary that has defined much of Boston and Massachusetts is going to be a lot more diverse. It's going to be dramatically more diverse. We're going to not see only growth in the African-American community, but in the Asian American community, in the Latinx community, and in so many other groups. And so that demographic growth also means that we have to be thinking about redistricting in a different way. And now I'll answer your question, which I think Lowell points a really great example of. In Lowell, you're absolutely right, Rahsaan. Those districts were essentially what historically had existed, what the status quo was, what the power structure was. And yet the community had diversified intensely to nearly half of the city now being POC, being people of color. And not just one type of people of color, but a very rich tapestry of diversity. And so when we started working with groups like the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association, it was about creating a district that represented not just the Asian American community, but also other elements of that growing diversity. And the district that was created was a coalition district, which I think is really the way of the future. It is building districts, not just around one community of color, but around multiple communities to support the inherent grassroots organizing that is already happening on the ground and to build bridges across communities of difference. And so to answer your question, Rahsaan, the work that we have done with community partners in Lowell has been part of that patchwork of making fixes to the political landscape so that there's more power invested in communities of color and grassroots communities and communities that are lower income. And I think that is a really great example of the type of work that we could be doing from a policy level through the drawing democracy work in this round with the new census data.
Thank you, Yvonne. And I think that's a key point that you lifted up, right? The work that you all are doing is putting you in touch with the folks who are on the ground. And even though you're coming in from a litigation standpoint or a policy analysis standpoint, there are a lot of people who have their lived experience being informed by what's happening in community. And so now I want to turn to Isabel to talk about the grassroots perspective. You know, redistricting is basically drawing the lines of the district, but it is the perspective of the people on the ground, particularly the folks who have historically been marginalized and left out and whose voices aren't oftentimes considered. That's a key piece that is missing. And so when we talk about creating communities of interest, you know, what are some of the things that grassroots organizers, people in community, want to share or need to be lifted up in this redistricting process to make sure that those who are kind of closest to the pain get closer to the power, to quote Congresswoman Pressley?
Thank you, Rahsaan, and good to be here with you all, David, Yvonne, and folks in the audience. I want to first highlight two things. One thing that David said, and then I'll expand on some things that Yvonne said. I think, you know, the biggest thing is that we need to see our communities represented in the electoral structure, and we don't see that in Massachusetts. And we need to see ourselves represented, our issues represented in the policies that are made, our priorities, and our issues represented in policies and procedures in schools and healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not happening. And that's why we're working super hard to organize within our communities. I would say, to David's point around investing in community and organizing, coming from Worcester, and I'm sure folks in Western Mass and Northeast and South Coast can also attest to this, that the lack of funding of community organizing in Worcester and other areas have left us with a vacuum. So we don't have the organizing structure or organizing power that Boston has, for instance. So in Worcester, we have never elected a person of color to the state delegation. We have never elected a person of color to be a mayor. We have an all-white, at-large school committee. So we as an organization have been working around the education equity issues and the exclusionary discipline policies that affect disproportionately Black and Brown students in a school district that has 70% kids of color. We are getting nowhere. The mayor isn't holding the superintendent accountable. The school committee isn't holding the superintendent accountable, even though 70% of our kids are being affected. Latinos are being suspended at high rates. They have 20% absenteeism. And so we're realizing, you know, that we're not gonna get anywhere with just organizing. And so to get to Yvonne's point, we are gonna engage in a lawsuit with the Lawyers for Civil Rights similarly to what Savannah and folks did in Lowell, to get in-district school committee seats in Worcester. Because the reality is there's a couple of things. One is most of the folks that get into this political career start in school boards. They start small and then they go up the ladder. Secondly, when you have all district all at-large school districts, it's harder to run for those seats. You have to get votes from everyone in the city. And the reality is in Worcester, you have to get it from the West Side. So currently our 7 school committee members, 5 of them live in District 1, which is the highest voting district. 6 out of the 7 live in the West Side, which is the most affluent white part of our city. And so with those dynamics, we're not going to get any policy changes in our schools because we don't have any representation from our communities. With in-district school committee seats, we can have representations from each district and we can make sure that the policies are reflective of what we need in our community. We can make sure that the voices of our EL students are heard, the voices of our special needs students are heard. But the reality is that running at large costs at least $30,000 in Worcester. If you had in-district school committee seats, then you're actually trying to get votes from a smaller population. And then most likely folks in your community know you, right? They're most likely to vote for you. So that's what we're working on in Worcester. Unfortunately, in 1983, there was a charter change because there was an at-large school city council, and they chose to change that to have in-district in-district city council seats, but they chose to ignore the school committee, unfortunately. So hopefully with Yvonne and Lawyers for Civil Rights, we'll have some changes in our school committee in the near future. It's not all about litigation, but we're finding that our organizing is not enough in a city where our voices are used to being ignored. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. I think that is a very poignant example of why this process needs to happen. And even though the state legislative district redistricting process doesn't touch school committee districts, what is impacted by that is the precincts that get drawn in relation to redistricting, because that informs how folks vote as well. And then sometimes you just got to sue people. So glad that LCR is there to engage in that. We're going to pause right now. As I stated at the outset, Congresswoman Pressley is working and the House is taking a vote, but she has just joined us right now. So I will briefly introduce her and invite her to make some remarks. But Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley is very well known to many of us. She is an activist, a legislator, a survivor, and the first woman of color to be elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Throughout her career as a public servant, Congresswoman Pressley has fought to ensure that those closest to the pain are closest to the power, driving and informing policymaking. Throughout her first term in Congress, Congresswoman Pressley has been a champion for justice, reproductive justice, justice for immigrants, consumer justice, justice for aging Americans, justice for workers, justice for survivors of sexual violence, and justice for the formerly and currently incarcerated. She serves on 2 powerful congressional committees, the House Committee on Oversight and Reform and the House Committee on Financial Services, both of which have remained focused on legislatively addressing issues of care, concern, and consequence to the American people. Prior to being elected to Congress, she served as the Boston City Councilor for 8 years and was the first woman of color elected to the council in its 100-year history. And so to take off of Isabel's point about some of these folks who rise to high office start out in some of these smaller offices, and it's just great when there are districts that are created that they can have a chance to run and win in. So without further ado, I welcome Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley to address us this evening.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be with you. I wish we could physically be together, but I appreciate the opportunity just to join you virtually. I was listening to that introduction, Rahsaan. It was generous, and probably the most important thing y'all need to know about me is that I am my mother's child. And my mother told me early on that it was a beautiful thing to be Black, and I should be proud of that, but that I was being born into a struggle, and that she had an expectation that I would do my part in that struggle. And so the work that I seek to do every day is just to to replace our oppression with liberation and to replace our trauma with healing. And that really does begin with representation. So that's why this discussion this evening around redistricting is so critically important. And I know I'm preaching to the choir and the converted, and so I'll enumerate some points that have already been made, but they beg repeating. You know, this is of critical import, the redistricting process for all of us, but especially for communities of color. Redistricting is the pathway to representation, to having our voices heard in elections, and to getting our issues addressed by the government. But when it is time to redraw lines that define political power, the United States has an extensive history of keeping community voices out of the conversation. It's always been my experience that Massachusetts is much more progressive in theory than we are in practice. And while we are quick to use hashtags and to wear lapel pins and to fly flags, diversity is one thing, but shared power is another entirely. So long before the current occupant of the White House, or squatter, as it were, as it is more accurately right now, long before Donald Trump was in the White House and started his campaign to circumvent the will of the people, politicians were doing the same thing in back rooms after every census. Decisions related to redistricting impact every level of government, as you well know from your member of Congress and the House of Representatives to your local city councilor. Politicians understand that redistricting can be a detriment for electoral outcomes, and so they are incentivized to draw lines that help to keep them in office, even at the expense of their voters. So this is a willful and intentional silencing, and I consider it criminal. And so that is why the work of the Drawing Democracy Fund and Drawing Democracy Coalition is so critical. Political power should rest in the hands of the people, but gerrymandering takes it away. And so here's another devastating edict in progressive Massachusetts. Gerrymandering was invented in Massachusetts in 1812, and it is alive and well all across the country more than 200 years later. It is one of the oldest tactics employed to dilute the political power of marginalized communities, most often of Black and Brown. And ever since Black folks earned the right to vote, redistricting has been weaponized against us. During the Civil Rights Movement, the advances in voter registration and turnout were weakened by racial gerrymandering. And even after the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed it, racial gerrymanders are still being litigated and struck down in the court system decades later. For example, some states draw political boundaries with the exact precision necessary to ensure they split the Black community into multiple districts, undermining the ability for folks to unite and to organize effectively. And of course, there's also prison gerrymandering, which uses the injustices of the mass incarceration system to inflate the census population of rural districts. People who are incarcerated, I believe, should be counted in the district of their permanent address, not where they're being warehoused. When our neighbors behind the wall are counted in the wrong location, Black and Brown communities are disproportionately impacted. Communities that have already been operating at a deficit in terms of political representation, divested from, under-resourced, and over-surveyed. Rather than making those investments in community to support an ecosystem whereby people can thrive and not be thrust into doing things for their mere survival that are later criminalized. And recently, Republican politicians have also begun engaging in so-called partisan gerrymandering, which looks almost the exact same as racial gerrymandering. So regardless of what you call it, gerrymandering in any form is unfair, unjust, and undemocratic. So we have to do all that we can to ensure the redistricting process reflects the will of the people. We have to center the voices of communities that are underserved and underrepresented. And we do that by prioritizing the people. So I'm proud to say that one of my first votes in Congress was to pass H.R. 1, the For the People Act. This bill includes common sense reforms to empower voters, to remove political gamesmanship from our redistricting process. It details clearly stated rules for how to redistrict, and partisan gerrymandering is expressly banned. Additionally, the bill requires the use of independent citizen commissions to work transparently to redraw lines. We need to pass this legislation in the next Congress, along with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Again, two bills that never made it to the Senate floor because of the justice obstruction of Mitch McConnell. The Supreme Court gutted the landmark voting rights legislation, and in this age of voter suppression, we need these protections now more than ever. So this is the time to organize. If 2020 has taught us anything, it is that organizing matters, whether it's police reform or voter turnout, organizing matters. So over the past year, organizers across the Commonwealth have worked painstakingly to ensure everyone was counted in the 2020 census. And if the challenge of executing the first ever digital census during a pandemic was not hard enough, the current administration constantly undermined the process every step of the way. In fact, just last week, since I serve on the Oversight and Reform Committee, and the census is under that jurisdiction, they're seeking to undermine the integrity of the census count by discounting those that are undocumented. And so my colleagues and I in the Oversight and Reform Committee continue to research, investigate, and to question census officials to guarantee that all people are counted. And again, last week we just had this hearing on the importance of an accurate count, where witnesses confirmed that over $1 trillion are impacted by census data. So my office continues to work with stakeholders throughout Massachusetts just to share information and resources. We did that to help folks in completing the census. The participation was robust. We thank many of you for being partners in that endeavor. But the fight to be included in the census really is only half the battle. When the numbers are published, then we have to fight to be included in the redistricting process. So thanks to the great work of advocates in Massachusetts, our state laws are more inclusive and are more transparent than ever before. When it comes to draw congressional and state districts, the Special Joint Committee on Redistricting needs to hear from all of you. The committee will conduct multiple hearings and maintain a public-facing website which shares information about their ongoing work, and I encourage all of you to engage in that process actively. One of the ways you can participate is by designing your own redistricting map using the publicly available software. You can literally show state legislators how to do their job. And even if they don't choose your map, you can hold them accountable by commenting on the map when they decide to adopt. So your feedback is important, and you should make sure that they hear it, because redistricting will decide the next decade of electoral politics in our Commonwealth. The very seat I sit in, as a demonstration of the power of this, was designed in partnership with community groups during the last redistricting process. It is the only majority minority district in the state. And this is, just the representation, 53% people of color, nearly 40% foreign born. So, in that I'm the first person of color, first Black woman elected to represent the Commonwealth in the House of Representatives in its 230-year history. White men make up only 31% of our country, but they hold 65% of elected offices, while women of color like myself only hold 4% of elected offices. So this data should embolden us to engage every tool at our disposal to enact change. And, I just thank you all for your activism, for being on the front lines of this. And I hope that you will always see me as an accomplice and co-conspirator in this good trouble, because these are worthy fights, and ones that we must continue to take on. So just like I participated in the census process, I will be participating in the redistricting process, and you should too. Always know that your voice is valuable and deserves to be heard. And most importantly, you belong at every table, every single table where decisions are made, and that includes the redistricting table.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Pressley, for your insightful and informative remarks that really bring what we're trying to do here home. So all the best to you in your continued fight for justice and representation. And I know that you have to go back to work.
I mean, sadly, y'all pray for me. I'm over here fighting for these reoccurring cash payments.
Yes.
For our families and making sure that they don't exclude our immigrant neighbors. So let me go and get that, okay?
All right, be well. Thank you so much. Bless you.
Thank you. I see you, Lizette. Good to see you. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye. So let us turn now back to the panel, and what we're going to do in these closing moments is, if there are questions that you have for the panelists, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we'll be taking the questions from the folks here on Zoom and questions for folks who are watching this on the live feed on Facebook Live. But to David, Yvonne, and Isabel, if you could just take a few seconds, maybe a minute, to respond to this final question, and then we'll get to the Q&A. What are the strategies that you are going to either lead or be a part of during redistricting to make sure our democracy is more representative and equitable? And maybe, you know, what are suggestions for some of the folks who might be listening for ways that they can get engaged and get involved? So let's do it in reverse order. Let's go Isabel, then Yvonne, then David.
So we are fortunate to be part of the Integrated Voter Engagement Project, which is working on regional hubs. And we are fortunate to be one of the organizations working in Central Mass, along with a lot of organizations that are on this Zoom today. And so it's really about organizing and working within community, not just as it relates to electoral work, but around the issues that are incredibly important. So I would imagine that we would integrate these conversations around redistricting as we did around the safe elections and census and other issues this past fall and this past year, quite frankly. We'll continue to be organizing collectively with organizations in our region and statewide around this. But the most important thing is for folks to really understand how this impacts your everyday lives. And it's not, community members need to hear it from their trusted community members, trusted stakeholders. So it's not even just me in our organization. We have organizers, and some of them on this Zoom, but also we have cultural brokers that are multilingual, that are able to outreach to the African community and the Southeast Asian community, et cetera, so that we're making sure that we're able to access and reach people where they're at. So it's not just about come to my organization so I can tell you about what's going on and how you can become involved, but how do we truly lift up all the barriers and all the inequities that exist to people participating, so that we have true democracy and we really go to folks where they're at and in the language that they speak and in an accessible way. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yvonne.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel, for that wonderful blueprint for success. I have to say that the Congresswoman's remarks were riveting, and just wanted to give a moment to acknowledge that powerful leadership. And I think a lot of what she said is what I want to echo, which is she sits in that seat in that district that was created out of the Drawing Democracy Coalition's work. And sometimes this work takes time to come to fruition. It took several election cycles for the Congresswoman to be able to occupy that seat. And that doesn't mean that that district was poorly drawn or was somehow defective. This is long-standing work that needs to be, we have to make the ground fertile. We have to have the infrastructure and the institutions, but then also some of this work is an investment over time. and it requires multiple methodologies deployed simultaneously. It requires the coordination of coalition efforts to drawing democracy. It requires community mobilizing in the way that Isabel and others have alluded to. It's wonderful that we have Cheryl Crawford from Mass Vote here, Beth from the Mass Voter Table. I mean, groups that are already doing this on the ground that are a part of the Drawing Democracy Coalition. And as Rahsaan and others have alluded to, including Isabel, and if necessary, it also requires litigation so that we can have our rights respected. And so I think it really is that complementing methodologies that are all deployed as part of the Drawing Democracy Coalition that is the recipe for success, using many of the ingredients that Isabel just pointed out to. And so I hope that people find inspiration in the fact that we have someone like the Congresswoman able to represent the district. And the idea here is to make sure that we can create even more of those opportunities, not just at the fancy congressional level, but also in some of the other ways that we've been talking about over the past hour, in the school committees, in the school boards, in the city councils, in the state house. And so all of that is what this work is going to look like come 2021.
Thank you, Yvonne. David.
Yeah, boy, I'm pondering great points here. I guess I want to circle back to Isabel's note and challenge, I think, to us about capacity in the community. And I'll speak as a funder, and I want to speak to fellow funders, just to say that, you know, this redistricting is a time discrete project that sets up the potential for true representation, which will then shape policies and resources that influence the context of our lives in the respective communities out there. These are not standalone things that are somehow hypothetical, political, or whatever, which is sort of the kryptonite for a lot of funders. I just want to say, when we came into this for Hyams back in 2010, I was just 2 years in. At that point, the Hyams Foundation was primarily a funder of services. And what happened is that we realized that we cannot talk about providing services and meeting needs in the community outside of looking at how public policy and resource allocation and legislation really shapes the context of all of those things and how they function or don't function in the communities that we care about. And it was at that point we decided to say we need to not only support service organizations, but to support the building of capacity of groups that are tied in and really represent their communities to be able to organize and analyze the issues that they're faced with. And that's how we began to get into community organizing. And that is the capacity, unfortunately, that is still lacking in overall funding from philanthropy that I would encourage folks to do. I mean, speaking for us, we have expanded basically all of our resources to support community building, but we're a small foundation that is focused on Boston and Chelsea. But even we recognize that Boston does not, as much as I am a homeboy, Boston does not exist alone, that we're part of a larger whole that is the Commonwealth, that there are gateway cities where emerging populations are coming forth and contributing dynamically to the growth of this state on which even Boston benefits from. And that these states and these communities are entitled to have the capacity to shape the policies that influence their lives for themselves and for the rest of us. So as a funder, what I would say to my fellow funders is that it's not enough to say you care about these communities and provide services. That's all well and good. Please recognize the connection that these services do not exist as a stand upon, that there's a larger frame which, you know, representative government actually shapes in a way that is more enduring and more of the building of the collective we, the social contract that we all hopefully support President administration that we hope to subscribe to. So I would encourage other funders to step up and feel free to contact any of us to talk about how you can get into this. This is what is needed. COVID relief, mass transit, evictions, all that is in play right now. And all that is very much real and related to all that we're talking about tonight.
Great. Thank you so much, David. And I just want to lift up the point that Yvonne put in the chat that this is nonpartisan work. It was back in 2011
Yes.
and it continues to be. Now we even provided technical assistance to the partners that were doing the work so that they knew how to operate within the confines of the law there. So I want to open it up for maybe, given the time, one or two questions. So Christina Mensick from Common Cause and Taniqua Hyams from the ACLU have been monitoring both this chat and the Facebook Live chat to see if there are any questions. But I want to grab one quick that I see from Myron Miller about the relationship that existed between the legislature and the advocates back then that exists. How can we ensure that that happens now? And I'll just say that we're already in conversation with the chairs of the redistricting committee as they exist right now. Who knows who will be the chairs in the next session, but we've already started those conversations and we've got upcoming meetings. So that's a great question. And the work always needs to continue to keep that pressure on to make sure that it is an accessible and open process. So Christina, are there any questions for the panelists in the chat? And then I'll turn to Taniqua.
Sure. So we got one question in the chat and then also over email. One was about what we see as opportunities to end prison gerrymandering here in Massachusetts, the process by which people are counted in the census and the place where they're incarcerated. And I think we can dovetail that with another question, which is on, are there any other opportunities that the panelists see to, when we think about representative democracy and a really representative redistricting process, are there other issues that we should work on? If not this cycle, then think about for the next redistricting process.
Okay, and for the sake of time, Taniqua, are there questions from Facebook, maybe one or two, and we can just put them all before the panelists and we can maybe close out with the answers to the questions that they're able to answer.
Yes, we have one question. Something that's very different from the last redistricting process is now we're dealing with COVID. And something that folks want us to think about is how can we continue to make sure that there's transparency and public engagement in a time where we can't physically be in the same space.
Okay, great. So what do we do about transparency and engagement during COVID? What are some of the other things that we need to be thinking about a representative democracy? And what are some of the things that we can do to deal with prison gerrymandering? So I'll open the floor up, whoever wants to answer.
This is Hyams. Maybe I'll start us off. I think the fact that we have now been living for quite some time with digital platforms, which many of our organizations were using even during census outreach and engagement, that provides a good blueprint for how we are able to engage in redistricting and outreach. I really do see this as needing the same type of deliberate and intentional efforts that many of our organizations were paying to the census. We were doing census Zoom meetings, census phone banking. We were doing Facebook activities on the census, all with an eye towards making sure that we could get people engaged with the census, even though many groups had normally held, let's say, like a fair or some type of street festival in connection with the census. We weren't able to do that because of COVID. And so I think it's about recreating the same type of engagement opportunities that we had with the census, but switching gears to redistricting side. Many of the same census partners and census allies are natural partners and allies for the redistricting piece. They're also going to be the folks who can convene community voices and perspectives, who could help determine where lines should be drawn. Like, where does a neighborhood organically end, or what are communities of interest that could be grouped together? That's the type of thing that we can't do from our office or even as a coalition without those community voices and perspectives. And so I think the digital use of platforms are going to be critical here. And then on the other more, I would say, thorny questions surrounding, for example, how we are taking into account the incarcerated population. I think those are excellent questions, and something that the Congresswoman alluded to as well, about having people counted in their homes and not counted where they're warehoused. I believe that's essentially what the Congresswoman said. I didn't quite write it down. But that was the sentiment, and obviously, speaking with an I statement, or at least on behalf of Lawyers for Civil Rights, we're in complete agreement with that approach, and I think that there could be a number of different interventions here. Again, thinking about the multiple methodologies that I was laying out before, this is something that we could be discussing with the state in order to ensure that the state has an appropriate process in place. But it's also something that is certainly worth looking at from a legal perspective, if there are some legal levers or hooks to be able to compel the state to do it if the state isn't otherwise interested in doing it. In full transparency, I'm sure Rahsaan and other lawyers in this meeting would probably agree. Some of this has been met with mixed success. It's not like there's a silver bullet for doing this through the courts. There have been some successful efforts in some states and disappointing outcomes in others. Mm-hmm. And so it really is a mixed bag here. And so this is the type of thing where if we were going to do it through a court, instead of pushing from a policy or legislative point of view, that we would want to be careful to make sure we are not creating bad precedent, particularly because it's such an important community issue. We wouldn't want to foreclose the door. So certainly what Rahsaan was alluding to, and I'll echo, building those relationships with the folks in the State House are going to be critical to make sure that not just POC perspectives, but also some of these other special populations, like the incarcerated folks, that those come to the forefront. So I just wanted to say a few thoughts to tee it up for some of the other panelists as well.
Yeah, and so I'll acknowledge that we are at time, but I do want to give either David or Isabel an opportunity to respond to any of those questions before we close out.
I will just quickly say that I would defer to Isabel, because even in this period of COVID, community groups I know do not have the option of isolating and functioning in Zoom. They're out there providing relief. They're out there, doing social media on radio programs and TV programs, really, providing the voices out there of information that the community trusts, because you're there day in, day out. And that's why, you're so vital and you need to be supported. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Isabel, and let you talk about how you do that.
Thank you, David. So I would just say, we don't have the privilege of isolating ourselves. I would say the other thing that's important around, someone mentioned transparency. I think data is incredibly important. Mm-hmm. So Yvonne talked about these different platforms. Mm-hmm. I think data is important for us to capture what are the community needs, what, we can tell you how many PPEs we've given out and how many food pantries and all of that stuff to capture the needs of the community. But I think transparency is also needed in terms of, what's the data in terms of, the census numbers, so that we can, in working with the state, be very clear upon what we need and what the community really looks like and what we need, because we understand that the state sometimes has their own vision of what they want. An example of that is, we know what's happening in the schools in terms of discipline, but the schools will not make the data accessible. So we essentially have to go through, Yvonne's organization to ask for FOIA requests in order to then make our demands based on, accurate representation of what's happening in school. So I would say it's important for transparency in both ways, both in us as grassroots organizations, knowing what's going on in the ground and capturing what are the needs of the community, letting people know what we're doing. Now that a lot of us as grassroots organizations during the pandemic are now doing social service work that we never imagined doing before, but still connecting it to lifting barriers and addressing inequities and still doing our organizing work while we're handing out PPEs, right? But you know, still capturing what the community needs are at the same time and doing an assessment. But the other side is how do we then hold accountable the states by also making sure we have relevant data on the other side.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think that's a perfect note to end on. For the question on gerrymandering and civic engagement of incarcerated people, there will be a event next Wednesday, I believe at 5:30. I just dropped the link in the chat if folks want to learn more about the work that's happening to increase civic engagement behind bars and advocate on behalf of those who have been disenfranchised in the Commonwealth and make sure that they have proper representation. I want to thank our panelists this evening for participating and sharing such important insight and encouragement and inspiration for the work ahead. I want to thank Congresswoman Pressley for taking time out of her busy schedule to grace us with her presence, but more importantly, with her words of wisdom and encouragement and inspiration for the fight that lays ahead. And to all of you for coming out this evening, taking time out of your evening to be a part of this very informative, important conversation about what needs to happen to make sure that every corner of the Commonwealth is well represented, but particularly those who have been left on the margins by larger society so that we can increase access to power. So thank you all for coming out. Good night.